Hi everyone, thanks so much to you all for joining us today. I'm Victoria, an associate in the employment team. Sorry, where I can't join us today, so a bit of a downgrade. But just here to do a very quick introduction to our speaker today, Nellie Whaley, who joins us from Salvesen Mindroom. You may have joined us in the last session where Nellie took a walk through understanding ADHD in the workplace. Today, you obviously know you're joining us to have Nellie speak to us around understanding autism in adults. The webinar will explore various aspects of autism within the workplace, and it will provide historical context and discuss common profiles, strengths, and differences. So this, as I'm sure you will know by now, is the second in a series of four webinars in relation to neuroinclusion. I'll leave the link for the other sessions in the chat, just in case you haven't had the opportunity to sign up yet. We would love to see you there. A couple of housekeeping rules. I'm sure we're all kind of used to these by now when it comes to webinars, but please do mute your microphone just so we don't have any background noise. Obviously, throughout, please do feel free to ask questions via the chat function. And we're hoping to have a little bit of time at the end for questions, but yes, as I say, please do leave them in the chat function. Nellie's also left helpfully a link to a Jamboard page in the chat, and you can use this to leave anonymous questions if you'd rather ask questions anonymously. Importantly, today's webinar will be recorded, and if you have any questions in relation to that, please do see the privacy policy on our Burness Paull website. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nellie, and we can get onto the main event.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for the warm welcome, and hello and good morning to everybody who has joined today's session. For those who may have not attended last session, just as a very wee introduction to myself. So as Victoria said, I am Nellie Whaley. I am the training manager at Salvesen Mindroom Centre. So I lead on the Neuroinclusion at Work programme and our neurodiversity training a bit more broadly as well. I've been working in the field of neurodiversity for around 10 plus years now. My background started in inclusive education, and I have worked for Mindroom since 2020, and I have been part of their family outreach service, and I supported parent and carers directly as well. For those, again, who may not be familiar with Mindroom, I hope you guys are by now, but if not, just a very brief introduction, and just to remind you that we are obviously holding these deep dive sessions over the course of the weeks. But for those who are members of Burness Paull, you do have access to some of our Eventbrite sessions as well. And if for those who might just be interested in them, I'll send you a link after today's session. We do also have our direct help and support service. It is available across Scotland. So again, if you are in today's session, we are focusing on adults in the workplace, but we do have a service for parent and carers and children and young people as well. So again, if there was a service which might be helpful for you today, I will make sure that you have that information following today's session. So I won't read out the learning objectives today. Victoria's kindly giving a nice overview there for me this morning. But just to kind of give you a bit of a key point, this is going to be an introduction to understanding autism in adults, and we will relate to the workplace. My plan today is to give you an overview of what autism is. We're going to talk a little bit about the prevalence rates, the language, and a bit more of a historical context, and then really think about approaches within the workplace. So just to kind of get started today, I would be happy to invite any kind of questions or comments of what people in the room would like to get out of today's session. As Victoria had mentioned, we will do a Q&A towards the end, and if I don't get round to answer questions, then I would be very happy to follow them up after. But if you would like to pop anything in the chat, please do so, and I can kind of link back to that towards the end. I might pause and look at the chat whilst I go as well, but if I don't, I will get to your points or comments towards the end of the session. So I will just leave it a moment so people can just have a little think. And please feel free to, just continue to add questions or use the Jamboard throughout today's session. But just to highlight neurodiversity a little bit more broadly before we delve it into autism, I just wanted to start the session to kind of show you the prevalence rates of neurodiversity across the UK at the moment. So at the moment, the statistic is around 15 to 20% of the population. So that equates to around 10 million people in the UK. So probably a lot more than some may have expected, and a lot more common than we think. So it's estimated around 1 to 7 people are neurodivergent. So it is likely in your organizations or the clients you're supporting, you will be supporting neurodivergent individuals. Today, we are going to focus on one of the neurotypes, which is going to be autism. So that's why we're all here today. I will start off the session by just giving a little bit of a historical context, prevalence, and a little bit about the diagnosis, and we'll go in a bit more detail as we go on today. So just to begin by exploring some of the history, autism was first just described around in the 1800s, but it didn't become a recognized medical condition until the century after. So this was actually following studies by an American psychiatrist, and their name was Leo Kanner. Now, autism is a quite complex condition, and though the underlying diagnostic criteria does remain consistent, how it presents in individuals varies enormously. So you'll hear me say it today, you probably heard me say in the ADHD session, that how it presents in each individual is going to be very unique to themselves. Today, if you were to go through the neurodevelopmental pathway, somebody may receive a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or known as ASD, although it's often kind of referred to autism spectrum condition or just autism. There may be somebody who has a diagnosis of Asperger's, and this diagnosis is no longer being used as the diagnostic language, but those with an Asperger's diagnosis, that is very prevalent, and that is in their own right. But at the moment, there has just been changes in that as well. If anybody is interested, I'd be happy to give you a bit more information. In terms of prevalence, at the moment, it's said to around 1 to 2% of the population are estimated to be autistic, although these estimates do vary, and of course, this is based on those with a diagnosis. There are approximately 700,000 autistic people in the UK. So that's around kind of 2.8 million families. So at the moment, again, it does vary, but the latest statistics, and I did read an article only today, which I will pop in the delegate pack, but it is around 150,000 people are on the waiting list for an assessment at the moment, and this is specifically linked to autism. In terms of the prevalence rates in gender, at the moment, autism is more commonly diagnosed in males, and the most up-to-date ratio is 3 to 1. So while there isn't no definite answer to why this is, a bit of an over-representation of men, it is believed that autism is undiagnosed in women. And at the moment, it's actually women who are seeking a diagnosis of autism and ADHD actually as adults in kind of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that's the most prevalent at the moment in terms of who are seeking out a diagnosis. Autism can present very differently in girls and women and males. And we'll talk about, we won't go into too much detail today, but if you are interested, we do have a session on our Eventbrite which does focus on neurodiversity and women and girls as well. But there are several theories why this is. One of it is maybe there's a bit of gender bias in testing and diagnostic tools. There's another theory of kind of gendered socialization processes and actually perceptions of some female behaviors. Also, kind of professionals may not be looking for neurodivergent conditions in girls or females if they have been diagnosed with a prior kind of mental health condition or issues. And lastly, another theory is masking, and that many girls and women are known to mask their autistic traits with a range of sophisticated kind of coping strategies. Now, autism can occur on all intelligence levels, whilst recent research in Scotland does suggest that it's around 1 in 5 children may also have an intellectual disability, and other research shows it's 1 in 3. So there are research and statistics which differ slightly, but the main point here is that it does vary, and it's going to be very unique to each individual. Autism itself, it is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition. It is present from birth, although presentation can change, of course, as a person matures and develops. The average age for a diagnosis is usually 5 years old, but of course, this is changing. And as I've mentioned earlier, the fastest growing group seeking a diagnosis is adult women. In terms of kind of causation, there's no single known cause, although it is thought to be genetic and be linked to more than one genes. There are many other theories kind of relating to autism as well, but the prevalence is kind of the genetics at the moment, which what research is telling us. It is really important to acknowledge that for some, autism in a combination somebody might have other neurodevelopmental conditions and other physical health conditions as well. So it can, for some, have a profound impact on an individual's quality of life. And research does estimate that it's around 90% of autistic people will have a co-occurring condition, and actually 50% will have 4 or more co-occurring conditions. So it's just keeping that in mind. That's a bit of a general outline, which I've just gone through. And given the fact that autism is a spectrum, but I'm going to talk about a spectrum in a slightly different way today, which might be different from what some people may have envisioned it prior today, but that actually it really does vary for everybody. So just a quick highlight, this slide here. So this is a slide which is the diagnostic criteria for autism. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but these 5 points here are things, if you're going through the neurodevelopmental pathway, are things which will be kind of asked and questioned, and this is where you kind of need some evidence to support. So just if we I'll go through these briefly, but just kind of starting off from A and going down. So when we talk about social communication and social interaction, what that means, it might be that a person may find eye contact difficult. It may be that they don't enjoy small talk. It might be somebody having difficulties kind of reading or interpreting body language or tone of voice. It might also be somebody not understanding social rules, which many of us may take for granted. It might actually be someone having a preference for being alone. And yeah, it could also be that they may have high levels of anxiety due to previous experiences around kind of social situations. And we're going to go into a bit more depth as we go on. But that's when I mean about kind of that social communication and social interaction. So it can mean a lot. It's not just one thing. Now, if we just look at B, when we talk about kind of that restrictive and repetitive patterns of behaviors, it means it could be a preference for something. So it could be a preference for a routine, it could be sameness, it could be the predictability. It could also be somebody who has quite fixed perceptions and thoughts, and it could be somebody who's quite black and white in their thinking. So just somebody who's quite honest, as an example. It also might mean somebody might find it difficult to imagine doing something, and it can make it difficult for somebody to maybe kind of deal or cope with unpredictability as well. So that's just a little bit for B. Just thinking about this deep interest a bit more, it might be that it's in one area, or it can change, of course, but it is an area where they might have specialist knowledge in a specific area. And like I'll kind of go and mention this in a bit, but it can be a bit more wide ranging than that kind of trains, mobiles, and kind of aeroplanes. It can be very diverse. It can be linked to anybody's interest. In terms of, there can also be something which is called stimming, and that can be linked to kind of repetitive movements or sounds or phrases which an individual may use, and that might be to help somebody focus or regulate their behavior. But that is something which also, if you're going through the criteria, might be noted, or something which may come up as well. There are lots of other things to kind of think about. We're going to talk about that as we go on today, but it might be linking to maybe sensory sensitivities. That might be aversion to light or sound. It could also be regulating their emotions. People with autism may report kind of challenges in other areas, such as emotional regulations and executive functioning. Again, we're going to kind of talk about that in a bit more. But if you was going through the diagnostic pathway, I suppose it is important to reflect that, again, there's so much there which maybe could be evidenced or talked about as an adult. And I think when we're thinking about an adult, you have to be able to show it's present in early developmental period. So that's why, similar to what I mentioned in ADHD, is that if you've got any, documentation, so even from school or feedback from families, that can be quite helpful as well. Okay, so that is probably enough to kind of go through the criteria here. I've mentioned that actually, in terms of the vocabulary being used, is around kind of autism or autism spectrum disorder. There are also profiles of autism, which can be identified, such as pathological demand avoidance. That's usually known as PDA. So that sometimes can be identified at that stage or at later stages as well. So in summary, to obtain a diagnosis, a person needs to not only meet the diagnostic criteria, but they must also evidence the impact on their lives. So a person can meet the full criteria, but if there's no negative impact on work or education or social relationships, a diagnosis may be unlikely to be given. So yeah, it's been able to evidence that and showing that impact. So yes, if you've got any questions, please pop them down, and then I will get to them towards the end of the session as well. So I did mention autism spectrum. I think we've all heard this before. But what I really wanted to illustrate is this image, which you can see here. And hopefully this helps kind of see it as a notion of it being more like a color wheel than a linear line. Because there has been notions of, we can see here that there are some terms which maybe aren't, positive or useful, kind of like high functioning and low functioning. And these terminology is not really being used at the moment. So yeah, it's kind of looking at it in terms of this wheel rather than kind of somebody going from a line at this point and that where they are on the scale. So hopefully this visual helps describe that and show you that. I did want to show you a video. So this is going to be a video of an adult who will talk about their experiences of autism. Now whilst you're watching the video, I just want you to kind of keep an eye out on anything, if there's anything which you may notice that is a strength or a difference, and if you can see any particular challenges which may relate to your own working environment. Now, we've got the chat function. I've also got the Jamboard, so if you do want to add anything, please do. But I'm just going to play the video now. I'll ask Victor or Enya to come in if there's sound issues, but I think we should be okay.
Living with an invisible disability is soul-crushing, but it empowers me to make a change. I am autistic. Growing up with autism in London was hard because travelling on buses in London, trains, delays, things not running to a schedule all caused me severe uncomfort and distress. Before my diagnosis, I struggled to make friends, I felt isolated, and had difficulty forming bonds with other people. Add to that the confusion as to why nobody else was like me, and not having a diagnosis until I was 30, it led to a pretty confusing childhood and teenage experience. So I spent my teenage years and late childhood searching for places where I felt welcome. Tabletop games were one of my many outlets that gave me a way to socialize without socializing. This led me to designing tabletop games, designing events where people could socialize and take part in something where the social anxiety of interacting with the person that was at the table was taken away by the tool, which was that board game or role-playing game or experience.
In the UK, 1 in 100 people are on the autism spectrum, and there are around 700,000 autistic adults and children.
One of the things I highly recommend is if you feel like you are autistic or certain things you identify with, is to just go and get a diagnosis for yourself, because it will change the way you develop and interact with the world. It did for me. My differences don't describe me. What makes me me is my determination to help and change the perception that people have of being different. Whether you're a minority of a minority, the easiest thing to start your road to feeling accepted is to discover what it is about yourself that makes you different and come to terms with it. Autism isn't who you are. Autism is an aspect of your personality that you learn to understand and incorporate into your everyday life.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to take a wee check on the chat just to see if there's anything relevant come up. There's a few in here. Okay. Nothing I need to answer right now, but thank you very much for people who have added in the chat. I will kind of go back and reflect on some of these in a moment, but very helpful. So just wanted to highlight here. So on this screen here, this is a range of autism kind of presentations. As with everything what I will mention today, this will vary amongst individuals, and I haven't included the whole range of traits. This is just a summary, so keep that in mind, and each individual will have their own unique experience. So if I just explain a little bit more, I mentioned it a little bit in the diagnostic criteria, and it is this element of kind of social communication and interaction. Now, for some autistic individuals, they may have a unique communication style. Some may prefer using kind of alternative methods of communication. It might be such as written notes or gestures rather than verbal communication. Others may actually struggle with understanding that non-literal language like idioms or sarcasm. Of So this sometimes can have an impact in that kind of workplace culture and environment as well. When we talk about deep interest and behaviors, so for many autistic individuals, they do often have a particular focus interest on a specific subject. So this interest can be a source of passion and expertise, but it might be difficult to steer away from during conversation or even a daily activity. As I mentioned earlier, this can be very wide-ranging and it may not always fit that kind of stereotype, which we may have of classic autism obsessions like trains and planes and automobiles, like I've said. An individual can have a fixation on anything. It could be music, it could be a particular movie genre, it could be a particular book, specific species or wildlife or the environment more generally. We do sometimes hear the word info dump, and this is used when an autistic individual may share kind of their extremely deep and wide-ranging knowledge on a particular subject. If they're allowed to do so, they can go boom, and here's all the information there for you. One thing which can be quite particularly challenging for individuals with autism is kind of that unexpected change in routine. Many may require kind of that structure and predictability of a routine, and an unexpected change in plans can lead to anxiety and stress. Now, in the workplace, we know that things can happen, things can change, but it's helping as much as you can to reduce those anxieties. So for example, if you've cancelled a meeting, tell somebody why. Tell them that, if they was needing to prepare something, have that in advance as well. And if anything does change, if you can, as much as you can, to support that unexpected change, and just being aware that actually it could impact somebody's anxiety levels or their emotional regulation. Here we've got sensory sensitivities. Now, many individuals with autism may have sensory sensitivities. This may make them highly responsive to sensory stimuli. So, for example, they might be hypersensitive to sound. That could even be such as like somebody opening a crisp packet or the traffic going by outside. It could be a bright light, it could be certain textures, which can cause an element of discomfort and a feeling of overwhelm as well. For some autistic individuals, they may perform what is known as a stim, so that's kind of repetitive movements. So this supports somebody to provide a necessary amount of physical or sensory stimulation. So that could help them to concentrate or just regulate their emotions. So there is a stereotype, but there are some also examples of somebody who might be rocking to provide that stimulation. It can take many forms. It might be somebody who is just not being able to stand still, so it's kind of walking round a few times. It could also be like seeking deep pressure, so kind of like pressing onto the hands or kind of tensing muscles. It could also be hair twirling, chewing gum, assessing doodling. It can be whatever supports that individual to respond to, it might be that sensory stimuli to help them through it and focus, or it might be supporting with that kind of emotional regulation as well. I am going to talk a little bit more about sensory sensitivity because there's a few more things which I want to add, but I've got another slide which I'll do that in a moment. Emotional regulation. So individuals may face challenges regulating their emotions. So they might experience quite intense emotions to seamlessly small triggers, or have difficulties expressing their emotions in kind of socially expected ways. Now, this can manifest very differently for each individual. I do just want to highlight three things how it could be seen as in the workplace. One of it could be a meltdown. So this is a person given an external representation of what is going on for them internally. So it could be somebody who's got frustrated, who is maybe being more verbal, or even aggressive, or, you know, having to to kind of move themselves out of a situation. So that's that external representation. There's also shutdown. So this is when a person becomes quite withdrawn and feels unable to engage or outwardly express what is happening for them. So this means things are like happening a bit more internalized for that individual. So it might be somebody who just, you know, isn't able to communicate at that time. When I'm talking about autism and maybe some young people, it's that kind of stereotypical, maybe they've got their kind of hood over their head, but actually it might be somebody just needing that time and they're unable to kind of participate even in a small dialogue of conversation at that moment in time. Another one is burnout. So this is often a result of exhaustion associated with masking. So this refers to somebody applying strategies to cover up the fact that they might find the world or the sensory sensitivities or the situation they're in quite difficult to navigate or to fit into. So yeah, again, it's just important that we think about emotional regulation in different ways, and I hope that was helpful. The last one here is mental health, and I wanted to include this in terms of presentation because for autistic individuals, they can be more susceptible to mental health challenges such as anxiety. So this social anxiety, for example, that may arise due to kind of challenges in understanding kind of social dynamics, or if they experienced social rejection in the past, or bullying, or stigma, or some form of isolation. So it's important that we have mental health in the forefront of when we're supporting, I suppose, anybody, kind of, you know, neurodivergent or not, and it's taking that trauma-informed approach because again, we don't know what somebody's experiences has been. So for people in the workplace, they might have had a negative experience in that workplace. So again, it might be that they're reacting to things which maybe seem a bit of an overreaction, but for them, it might be an experience of what's kind of happened to them in the past as well. So I did say I just wanted to talk a little bit more around sensory input. I could talk about this all day and I won't, but I just want to highlight the few three here, which you may not be familiar with. So I think we could all say what our 5 senses are, but I do want to kind of showcase 3 others. So these 3 additional senses that can also have an effect on your sensory sensitivity. We have this one, which is vestibular. So this is kind of our gravity or motion sense. So what that does, that helps us understand the direction our body is going. So for an example, if we're on a roller coaster, although you are not physically moving yourself, your body is being propelled forward through space. So your vestibular sense relays that information to your brain. So for somebody, they might be seeking that vestibular sensation. So it might be somebody occurring that kind of stimming behavior, such as rocking or spinning, and this will provide somebody with a degree of vestibular input. Next one here is proprioceptive. So this is a sense that lets us know where our body is in relation to the world around us. So for example, if I scratch the back of my head here with my hand, I can't physically see my hand, but my proprioceptive skills helps me situate where it is. So there can be differences for that proprioception skills for individuals with autism, which may impact their coordination skills and their motor skills. So it could be that they bump into things or they're not aware of kind of that kind of space around for given the right space to another person, for an example. And then the last one here, we've got interoceptive. So this sense allows us to read our internal physical cues. So this can be such as hunger or needing to go to the toilet. So for some neurodivergent individuals, and in particular autistic individuals, they may experience interoceptive cues quite differently, or they might actually just struggle to recognize those sensations. So that could be a sensation of actually feeling hungry or feeling full. It might also be able to recognize the physical sensations that indicate when you're beginning to feel anxious. So it's really this internal cues. So what can really be helpful for some people is kind of wearing a smartwatch and like setting reminders maybe of when you need to go and get a drink, or having a water bottle, which kind of gives that indication, because some people might just go a whole day and not be drinking any water just because their interoceptive skills hasn't indicated that to them, as an example. So yeah, lots of information here. I do want to highlight, as always, the strengths, and I know I've got a few questions popping up in the chat, so I'm going to go back to them in a moment. So that was a whistle-stop tour for you, kind of how autism could be presented, and again, it could be varied, and I haven't covered everything there. But in the workplace, I think it's really important that we are starting the conversation with what is going well, what are people's strengths. So on the screen here contains some examples of strengths often reported by autistic adults, but as always, this will vary from person to person. So what have we got here? We've got long-term memory. So for autistic individuals, they do often possess an exceptional long-term memory. So once they are interested in a topic, they can retain vast amount of information over an extended periods of time. Of course, they're going to become very valuable resources of knowledge in the workplace. Next one we've got here is that autistic individuals tend to pay close attention to details and notice nuances that others may just completely miss. So this strength contributes to their thoroughness and their accuracy in tasks and their observations as well within the workplace. So autistic individuals can often excel in that analytical thinking, which we've got here. So they can, they may be able to break down quite complex problems into smaller components and analyze them to find solutions, which of course, that's what we want in a workplace. Autistic individuals may also demonstrate a preference for logical thinking, and they may rely on factual information. So this approach can lead to well-reasoned and evidence-based decision-making. Autistic individuals are known for their honesty and their integrity. I did mention that right at the beginning of the session, but they do value truthfulness, and they might actually find it challenging to be deceitful, which makes them being trustworthy individuals. Link into that as well. So autistic individuals are often very loyal and reliable in their commitments. So they do take the responsibility seriously and can be counted on to fulfill their obligations. Linking a little bit to my analytical and logical, we've got that pattern spotter. So being able to spot things which, you know, might not be seemingly obvious, and bringing a fresh perspective to the table. Here I've got just reflecting on somebody's kind of empathy skills. I know there can be some, even in the media, some kind of misunderstanding about that, I would say, around autism. But autistic individuals are very kind and have very strong empathetic skills towards others. So they can really understand and support others' emotions in unique and profound ways. Again, this might just be slightly different or unique to how somebody else might show their empathy skills. Innovative thinking, this is really just creating, you know, bringing that creativity and that originality. So bringing that unique perspective, which leads to some fresh and insightful solutions. And last but not least, this is something which is very prevalent for autistic individuals, is that deep intense and specialized interests. So this could be a passion and expertise in specific subjects, which of course can lead to deep knowledge and contribution into those areas. So again, really important that we kind of think about these and have these in conversations when we are supporting our autistic colleagues. So I know everybody here today probably wants some practical approaches as well. So I'm going to get to those. But before I do that, I do just want to, I mentioned the criteria, but I just wanted to highlight what the autistic diagnostic pathway would be. And it's actually very similar to the ADHD pathway, which I would have mentioned last week. So if you attended last week's session, you would have kind of heard me kind of go through this. But yeah, it's just thinking about what to be aware of when you are going through that pathway. So we know that some of the things which may be asked could be quite sensitive and personal. So you might get asked things several times. So it's just, if you can be as prepared as possible, like take notes, a diary, it is okay to do that. And that can be really helpful when you're going through the pathway. I'm not going to go into detail of what you would be asked. You know, it might be things such as family medical history, kind of what their early developmental was. That could be, you know, if again, this would be getting feedback from your own kind of parent, carers, of, you know, people who were around you at that time. They'll talk about kind of health, how details of your education, that's quite important, family life and social life as well. So this, when you're going through the procedure, the pathway, sorry, just reflecting that, taking some notes and evidence is going to support you through that as well. So yeah, the first initial thing would just be going to your GP, and then you'll be then referred on. As I mentioned at my last session, there is a waiting list for the NHS, and that does lead people to kind of go to the private diagnosis, and quite similar to ADHD. It is important to do your research. And for autism and ADHD, it can only be formally assessed by a UK registered psychiatrist or a specialist ADHD or other kind of appropriate qualified healthcare professional. So we are talking about autism today, and it is kind of similar in cost. Like it can cost up to kind of £3,000 going through a private diagnosis. They will often just screen for one condition, such as just autism, and may not screen for other current conditions such as dyslexia or dyspraxia. The quality of assessment can vary. So again, just check the providers. The Autistic Society are quite good. They've got like a list, and again, I'll provide you some information following today's session as well. And just linking back, if there are any shared care or post-diagnostic support, somebody could be liable for that financial support, or some GPs or social worker services might not recognize the private diagnosis to be involved in that share care. So I know some adults who have gone through the pathway who end up getting the private diagnosis, but then end up, you know, still being on the waiting list to kind of get their NHS to support with that. So yeah, if a person is seeking a private diagnosis because, you know, that is, you know, you've got the financial means and that's what you want to do, just kind of seek some advice, speak to a GP first. That's what we'd always recommend, and just clarify issues such as if there's anything around shared care as well. So I'll just quickly check. So I know we're going to come round. I'm just going to be finalising the session shortly. So I think I'll have time to kind of go through some points and questions. But I think there's just some comments at the moment in the chat. So thank you all for participating and just using the chat to engage with one another as well. Okay, so just to I've got one short video which is I think a minute long, which I just wanted to highlight, and then we'll go on to approaches.
life of an autistic mind, a mind that's a slightly different.
I'm just going to replay that.
This is the life of an autistic mind, a mind that's a slightly different kind. She isn't always as others would be. She sees the world differently. There can be exasperation and frustration, just trying to understand everyday conversation. And sometimes you can't show the real you when people don't like the things you do. But wouldn't the world be dull and plain if we all thought exactly the same? It's good that minds aren't like each other. It gives the world its ideas, its colour. So be kind to the autistic mind, the mind that's a slightly different kind.
So I just wanted to show that to bring in kind of what we've talked about, the presentations, the traits, and now we're going to just end today's session of just thinking about some practical things which we can implement in terms of approaches to support in the workplace. So I've broken these down, which links to some of the presentations which we talked about during today's session. So we've got executive functioning. So this is somebody kind of maybe their processing skills. They might need a little bit of support to have things visually relate to them instead of kind of just basing on verbal communication. So for example, for executive functioning, what can be really helping is like breaking it down, use of task analysis. So maybe supporting somebody to think about what they need to do, what are their priorities. Visual timers and schedules can be really helpful. So these tools can help kind of plan and manage tasks and appointments. If you can, keep information accessible. So somebody can use text to speech, or if you can provide information in different formats as well, can be really, really helpful. But yeah, these are just a few quick points, which doesn't cost a lot of money or time, but which can be really significant in kind of supporting somebody who just needs a little bit of just a help to ensure that they can do their tasks appropriately. Information processing. So it could just be advanced planning, and that can reduce anxieties as well. So the more prior understanding of upcoming situations and opportunities to plan for these, the easier an individual is going to be able to cope with that. So, for example, they might just need a little bit more time to plan for an upcoming meeting. Or if you do have a deadline in mind, be very clear about that and think about what is expected. Or if you are giving a task, use clear and direct language. So there's no ambiguity in terms of what you're actually asking of that individual. Other things which can be quite helpful is kind of recording meetings. Sometimes putting somebody on the spot can be quite difficult for autistic individuals. So being very mindful of that, having different channels for people to communicate, offering an opportunity outside, whether it's a meeting or you've had a one-to-one discussion, have an opportunity to come back together can be really quite helpful as well. So somebody can process and then give you a response later. In terms of kind of that regulating emotion, I think with autistic individuals in the workplace, I've just highlighted that preparation and transition can be really helpful. I've mentioned that emotional dysregulation is often a result of somebody maybe feeling overwhelmed or burnt out or feeling anxious. So actually, if somebody knows what's going to happen in advance and they can be prepared quite significantly, that can reduce the likelihood of somebody feeling anxious or having challenges with their emotions. If you can kind of keep things as consistent as possible, for a person to be quite familiar to what they're expected in their daily routine, that can be helpful. That can make just that person in the workplace feel quite confident in what they're expected of the day. And then they can apply strategies to support them as well, so that they know what's upcoming as well, and just help somebody to have that independence and that autonomy. If they know what to do, they'll be able to choose that as well. Just highlighting here that trauma-informed is really important. I mentioned that kind of co-occurrence with mental health as well, but it's really to think about that overall experience for most neurodivergent adults in terms of the impact of, you know, many years of maybe them not fitting in, or maybe they have experienced bullying or some abuse on some basis. So it's really kind of ensuring that you're keeping that in mind and having a trauma-informed approach when kind of just supporting somebody. So it's providing that safety and reassurance. Sensory sensitivities. Now, for autistic individuals, that's probably going to be a really one to consider. So it might be just thinking about your environment. So that could be minimizing distractions, having sensory breaks. If there is an area which is quite noisy, have a quiet area. Think about less stimulating activity. If during the day, if that's possible, and even like kind of online stimulation as well. So help somebody kind of take that notifications, that stuff, which can be quite supportive. Lots you can do, and I'm happy to kind of explore that a little bit more if people have got any kind of questions. But yeah, even the temperature of a room, just making things that you know, everybody's going to have their preferences, but if you're able to offer choice, I think that's going to be a big one to support individuals. What can help around mental health is really taking that strength-based approach. We've talked about so many strengths today, so ensure that is how conversation is being led. Also, kind of use of reassurance and encouragement, and having regular times for one-to-ones. That's going to be really helpful for people to kind of go back and check in. Last but not least, kind of social interaction. I think if you can be aware of personal preferences. So some people may struggle in group situations. That might be due to difficulty in actually focusing. But it also can be anxiety around being around individuals which they may not know, or actually just kind of following a conversation could be quite difficult. So you might actually get the best version of somebody in a one-to-one setting. I think also creating opportunities for positive interaction. Again, if you can be person-centered in this, think of ways which you could be slightly different in terms of how you are doing social activities. That might be your do, for example. It might not be having that expectation that everybody needs to attend if they don't feel comfortable to do so as well. And it might be somebody having even access to kind of neurodiversity affirming coaching, just to help them kind of think about their traits, their presentations, what their neurotype means to them, to support them in the workplace as well. So hope that was helpful whistle stop tour today. I know there's a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to stop talking and I might invite either Victoria or yeah, probably Victoria, if there's any questions which you can notice which I've maybe not covered, which are in the chat, and I'll be happy to cover.
Just having to look now. So a few people have been saying, are some of the strengths listed not similar to the strengths for those with ADHD diagnoses? And there's some discussion on that between people on the chat, just to see whether you have any thoughts on that, Nelly.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. I think with autism and ADHD, actually there is quite a lot of co-occurrence between the two. But obviously in terms of presentations, it can be yeah, it can be unique to that individual. And I know this just from, you know, supporting even young people who have a diagnosis of ADHD and autism, and parents sometimes coming to me and saying, oh, I don't know what best strategy to support them with, because actually their traits, how their presentation is quite different when you look at an ADHD. I suppose even if we look at the snapshot, what I've mentioned today in autism and maybe what I mentioned in ADHD. So it is different from everybody. And I think what I would say is just follow that individual's lead, speak to them and see where their strengths lie, and be guided by that, not necessarily maybe what the typical presentations might be, because there might be somebody who does have co-occurring conditions, which means that their presentations might be significantly different,
Mhm.
and how they experience the world could be different to somebody else because they might have multiple co-occurring conditions. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thank you. Somebody has asked, just I suppose in relation to other, not strictly related to the workplace, but in relation to sort of other medical diagnoses, and a potential autism diagnosis. Do you have any sort of experience on how a potential autism diagnosis affects, I suppose, the way the healthcare system treats other conditions, perhaps more physical conditions? Are there any, I suppose, adjustments made in that setting? Appreciate that's out with this a
No,
wee bit, but just to see if you have any experience.
yeah, no, I think it's a good point. And I think because it is a bit of a changing field in terms of the more awareness which is out there in terms of it could be a particular neurodevelopmental condition, it could be another medical condition. I think actually that can sometimes have some weight. It shouldn't. But in terms of that awareness and acknowledgement, it can be different. I think if we rewind 10, 20 years, 30 years, we know that autism, ADHD maybe wasn't in everyday conversations. So in terms of individuals maybe kind of seeking support from medical health professionals, we know that there are individuals who have been misdiagnosed, who maybe have come out with a mental health diagnosis, such as like bipolar, because at that time, maybe there wasn't that evidence linked that actually there was more prevalence. And I'm kind of just giving an example of kind of autism women as well. So yeah, I think sometimes it can have a significant impact on terms of the awareness and a cultural awareness as well. Not that it should, but I think that that could have something. So hopefully that kind of answers it a tiny bit.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Someone has also asked, are there any other useful tools other than a structured interview used for assessment formulation? So they give the example there of Genius Finder. That's something you've heard of.
Yeah, no, I have. There is so there is another one, Genius Within, and gosh, what is the other? Why has it not come to me? I will send a couple, but there are even some screening tests which can be quite helpful for individuals to figure out themselves where their skills best lie and what their presentations mean to them. So there are some useful tools. I'm gonna just make a wee note and make sure that I send a couple additional of them. I just can't get that in my mind right now, but there are a few, and thank you. I think that's really helpful. Like software and technology can be groundbreaking in support. So yeah, I think that's a good point. So thank you for those who mentioned it.
Perfect. And somebody has asked, is there any guidance for successfully onboarding someone with an autism diagnosis? Or I suppose if there's no kind of external guidance to refer to at the moment, do you have any, I guess, helpful tips for that?
Yeah, of course. I think what can be really helpful as well is just in terms of that diagnosis, the pathway to diagnosis, that people do have multiple points. For somebody with an autism diagnosis, they might not want to kind of express it straight away just because we know that there's been stigma before. So they might go to recruitment and there might have been things and they've got the job, but there might have been things which could help them, but they've just not mentioned it yet. So I think it's multiple times to support somebody during onboarding. Another thing is making a really clear plan and being quite adaptable of what that might look like for that person. So for example, if there was a lot of I know that in boarding we can have a lot of kind of looking at policies and
Mhm.
research on your own. I think just being clear what is expected of that person and what they need to do in a particular time frame can be really helpful for somebody who's autistic. But I know that we've come to 11 o'clock.
Yes.
So what I'll do as well, as always, we'll go back through the chat, and if there's anything we've not quite got to, I will pop hopefully some helpful suggestions, or some signpost you to some resources as well.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Nelly, for the presentation today. And thanks everyone in the chat for being, I know quite a few of you being very open and sharing your own experiences. So thanks so much as well for that candidness, I suppose, and opening up the conversation. So we really appreciate that.